Canada entered a technical recession in early 2026, and even though May's jobs numbers came back with a surprise 88,000 gain, the Bank of Canada still don't cut rates at its June meeting. That sounds messy until you look at what's actually driving inflation right now, and it's not wages or consumer spending. Energy prices tied to the Iran conflict kept the bank's hands tied at 2.25%, pushing the headline CPI up to 2.8%, even while core inflation sat near the 2% target and growth was shrinking. I'm going to show you the full picture so you understand why holding rates in a recession isn't a mistake and what it means for your investment strategy. Hi, Kane here. I was a starving artist that graduated from theater school. Through really hard work, I now own properties throughout Ontario. Watch my biography to see my struggles. Be sure to read the description below to see where I've pulled this information from. If you are thinking about investing, please speak to a licensed professional. This video is for educational purposes only. Without further ado, let's get started. The Bank of Canada had two completely different problems sitting on the same table on June 10th, and the way they handled both tells you exactly where the rates are going next. A technical recession means 2 consecutive quarters where GDP actually shrinks. And when that happens, the normal playbook for a central bank is to cut rates because cheaper borrowing gets businesses spending and consumers buying again, and that spending is what pulls the economy back up. Canada hit that 2-quarter mark heading into the June meeting, so on paper, the Bank of Canada had every reason to cut. Then, May's jobs numbers dropped and they weren't ugly. The Canadian economy added 88,000 jobs in May, and unemployment fell to 6.6% from 6.9% in April. That's not a labor market in free fall. So, you've got an economy shrinking, and on one measure and holding steady on the other. The bank can't just pick the number it likes and ignore the other one. That tension made the June decision harder than most people going into it realized. The energy price piece is where a lot of people lose the thread, so I want to spend a minute on it. Oil prices got pushed up by the conflict involving Iran, and that fed directly into the headline inflation, which is the number most Canadians see when they read the news headline about the cost of living. Core inflation, the number that strips out food and energy, was sitting close to the bank's 2% target. So the bank was staring at 2 inflation readings pointing in different directions at the same time, and it couldn't cut rates to fight the recession without risking the headline inflation number climbing higher. Cutting into an energy price spike doesn't fix the spike. It just adds fuel from the demand side on top of it. TD and RBC came into June calling a hold at 2.25%, framing it as the only reasonable move given how split the data was. Scotiabank's economist Derek Holt agreed on the June hold, but was far more hawkish about what comes after, forecasting 50 basis point hikes in the fourth quarter of 2026 and another in early 2027, eventually pushing the benchmark rate to 3%. The C.D. Howey Institute Shadow Monetary Policy Council penciled in a move to 2.5% by mid-2027, arguing that energy shocks tend to stay embedded in prices longer than central banks want to admit. Those positions aren't just different forecasts, they reflect a genuine disagreement about whether the bank should be more worried about the recession or inflation reading that won't come down cleanly. The lockup process on announcement day is worth understanding because it's not just procedural. Registered journalists have to arrive at the Bank of Canada's museum entrance in Ottawa by 8 a.m., where they've sealed in with no outside contact, no phones, no internet. They get the full release early, read it, write their stories, and the embargo lifts the second the bank publishes at 9:45 a.m. The whole room exists because a 30-second leak on the rate decision can shift bond markets by millions of dollars before an investor even sees the headline. The tariff angle made that process even more loaded on June 10th. The bank's April's 2026 statement had already named the U.S. tariffs uncertainty as a live risk to the Canadian economy, so markets were watching every word around trade policy. Any fragment of the June statement getting out before Governor Macklem's press conference at 10:30 a.m., read without his explanation, could have triggered a loonie spike or an equity sell-off based on incomplete context. This security protocol wasn't a formality, it was the bank managing a hair-trigger market reaction to language it knew was going to be read very carefully. Canada entered the technical recession and the bank still held at 2.25%. Energy prices from geopolitical conflicts were doing the same economic damage that wage growth and excess consumer spending normally do in an inflation period. Cutting rates into that without fixing growth would just add a second inflation problem on top of the first one, and two opposing forces are now holding rates in place. Weak domestic growth pulling toward cuts and energy-driven inflation pulling towards holds or hikes. The next move comes from whichever breaks first. So, where does that leave you right now? The hold at 2.25 was an indecision. The bank looked at a recession on one side and an energy-driven inflation problem on the other, and cutting rates won't have fixed either one. Watch the next inflation and the next GDP release before the July 15th meeting, because those two numbers together are what actually breaks the hold versus cut debate, and whichever way they move is where your variable rate mortgage and your bond yields go next. RBC expects to stay flat through the rest of 2026, pointing to economic softness that hasn't fully unwound, while CD Howie worries that energy costs are already embedding themselves into broader prices and sees 2.5% by mid-2027. Both can't be right, and if CD Howie is closer, your variable mortgage payment moves up again. If you've enjoyed this video, be sure to watch the next best passive investments for Canadians here. Thanks for watching.